From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Library of Congress on a wonderful fall afternoon. I'm Helena Zinkamp, the Director for Collections and Services. I'm going to start today's special program with a few remarks about the library's amazing research resources. Then Stefan Hanson from the Swedish Embassy will introduce our speaker, author and journalist Anders Rydell. He'll talk about his new title, The Book Thieves: The Nazi Looting of Europe's Libraries and the Race to Return a Literary Inheritance. We'll have time for questions afterwards, and then at 4, Anders will be available to sign copies of his book. At that time, you can also see examples of books from the Offenbach Archival Depot. The Library of Congress had staff in Europe after World War II, whose work included helping to return the stolen books. The display opens with an album of photographs showing 350 book plates that facilitated connecting books to their former owners. For publications that lacked any indication of ownership, the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Group organized the distribution of the orphans. The Library of Congress did receive several thousand volumes from the JCR, and close to 1,500 are identified in our online catalog with the heading Holocaust-Era Judaic Heritage Library. In other words, the library is a participant in helping to identify and make sure the books remain visible. These books are cared for by the Hebraic section of the African and Middle Eastern Division, which has brought 3 special titles to share with you, along with a brochure that describes them. Why would the Library of Congress take an active role in preserving international cultural heritage? Well, our name does emphasize that our primary duty is to the United States Congress. We answer questions for them, we undertake special research projects, but we are also the National Library of the United States, America's library, and that means that our mission is global in scope, to make resources available to sustain and preserve a universal collection of knowledge and creativity for future generations. Just a few numbers. We're the stewards for more than 164 million items in 470 languages, ranging from printed books, newspapers, and of course electronic databases, but also manuscripts and maps, movies and music, unique photographs and sound recordings. The shelving, they tell me they've measured it in miles, 840 miles. We believe you could drive all the way to Iowa or Wisconsin and return, and the books of the library would be lined up along the highway. While we are known as the largest library in the world, what really matters, of course, is content and quality. We're fortunate to have many divisions with subject matter experts to provide research guidance and insight into these massive collections, and we serve people throughout the world. The Librarian of Congress likes to say that we preserve and provide access to a rich, diverse, and enduring source of knowledge in order to inform, but also to inspire and engage you in your intellectual and creative endeavors. So whether you are new to the Library of Congress today or an experienced researcher, I see some familiar faces in the room, we have a world-class staff ready to assist you, either online or in person. Of particular interest this afternoon, of course, are the collections from or about Europe, which number in the millions, covering Slavic and Eastern studies, Eastern European studies, as well as Western European countries. We invite you to visit us or to reach out through the email service called Ask a Librarian. Taru Spiegel is our reference specialist for the Scandinavian countries and organized the talk today. Grant Harris, Chief of the European Division, is also here today, as well as our colleagues from the African and Middle East. I'd like to recognize their collective support for preparing this program. Is everyone's cell phone turned off? Just to double check? Okay, thank you. And please also be aware that this event is being recorded for future webcast. Thank you. Stefan.
Good afternoon, everyone, and hey, Anders. Hey. And first and foremost, thank you, Library of Congress, for hosting this wonderful start of the afternoon, this event, and we are very proud to partner with you in this event. And my name is Stefan Hanson. I'm Culture Officer of Embassy of Sweden, and we are located in House of Sweden in Georgetown. And if you've never been visiting us, please do, because we are having a lot of exhibition and literature events just like this ones and seminars. And we are open for the public and free all the weekends, all the year. And you can come visit us not only for exhibitions and theater performances, we also have a library room for children dedicated for the youngest ones, filled with treasures of Swedish authors. So please come and join us there. The Swedish government is very proud of our legislation about libraries. Every municipality in Sweden has a library all over the country. And the library's roles are crucial for a democratic society. And I would like also to say that Swedes are the people in the world that are reading the most. And that is based on facts. And citizens of today need to be exposed to training in critical analysis of texts, pictures, and video more than ever in this day and age of filter bubbles. And our minister, the culture of minister, is also the minister of democracy. And the Swedish government believes that culture, media, and literature allows people to grow as citizens, and that strengthens our democracy. But now back to this and back to Anders. We are thrilled that Library of Congress has invited the Swedish author Anders Rydell. Anders is an established journalist, editor, and author of nonfiction. Book Thieves is actually the second part out of 3. The first part dealt with the looting of artworks in the Second World War, and the third will talk about music. Anders' work on the Nazi looting of art and books has been translated into 19 languages, including German, Italian, Russian, and Chinese. And The Book Thief is his first book translated into English. And this has been a very busy year for you, Anders. You both published your first book in English here, yeah. And you also had your son.
Yeah. He's part of the exhibition.
So congratulations on that, and please help me to give a warm welcome to Anders Rydell.
Yeah, I will first say thank you for inviting me to this great library. And as Stefan told before, this is actually the second book in a 3-part series. The first book came out in 2013, and the last book I'm working on right now on the looting of music, instruments, sheets of music, and music literature. But it was when I started working on the book about the looting of art, I also discovered the looting of books, and it was a couple of things that got me interested in this subject. First of all, when you looked into the organizations that organized the looting, they didn't go after the art first. They went after the books, especially in France, and it was quite particular. And the other thing was the scale of it. The looting of books, the operation to loot, sort, and transport books was much, much larger than the looting of art. Art was, if you compare it, a small operation. But the last and maybe most important issue was that the organizations that was responsible for the looting of cultural items, they weren't really interested in the art. The art was sent to the big collectors like Hermann Göring and Adolf Hitler, of course. But what they were interested in was the books, and not just books, but also archives. And this was interesting because these organizations were also the central intellectual organizations in Germany. It was two. First of all, Heinrich Himmler's SS and Alfred Rosenberg's organization, ERR. The common picture we have of the book, The Nazis' Relations to Literature, is this. The book Burnings on the 10th of May, 1933. And it's a very strong picture, and I think this image of the Nazis, it's still powerful today, and it's so powerful because we want to believe that the Nazis didn't read books, they destroyed books. But the truth isn't that, and I think the truth is more horrific, actually. The book burnings in May 1933 wasn't an immense destruction of books. Actually, quite few books was destroyed. Already in 1933, the Nazis started looting books all over Germany. The book burnings was more a ritual, a symbolic display, where they burned books in a kind of ritual that a lot of Germans at that time understood. This was something that went deep in German history. 100 years earlier, German students had burned French literature after the Napoleon Wars. But the most important reference was to Martin Luther and his burning of the papal bull. Because in the Nazi perspective, the burning of the papal bull wasn't an act of religious freedom, it was a nationalistic act. It was the moment when the German people freed themselves from the Catholic Church, the power of the Catholic Church. In Berlin, 42,000 people came together on this night. And the speaker here was the new Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels. And he said, here the intellectual foundations of the November Republic sinks to the ground, but from the debris a new spirit will rise triumphantly like the phoenix. The interesting part here is the new spirit. What was this new kind of spirit? The Nazis didn't distance themselves from intellectuals, from poets, from librarians, writers, researchers. Actually, they recruited them, and very actively, because they needed them to create the image of a new human being. A couple of years later, a new institute was opened in Germany, a historical institute. And one of the historians here described the role of the historian in the new Nazi Germany. And this description, I think, is valuable also for other kind of academics, writers, poets. He said, the purpose of research is not to fight directly for power, but it can forge the weapons. It can provide us with shields. It can train the warriors and awaken the fire within them, hardening them against the trials that lie ahead. The goal of this institute is to develop weapons for the struggle of thought, one of the most important challenges of all. The Nazis always fought two kinds of wars. The first one was on the battlefield, the battle of soldiers, tanks, machine guns. But then they fought the other kind of war, the intellectual war, the war about ideology, the war where the Nazis wanted to prove that the Nazi ideology was the only true faith. And in this war, the looting was essential. During the research for this book, I used this map. And this map came from Alfred Rosenberg's organization, Einsatzstab Reichleiter Rosenberg, one of the most important looting organizations during the Second World War. And I took this map and made a travel for almost 6 months and followed the looters in the footsteps, from the book burnings in Berlin to the great Jewish libraries in Amsterdam, to Paris, to Rome, to Thessaloniki, and of course Eastern Europe. And the purpose of this trip was to see what happened to the libraries that was looted, what came back, what was lost, but also to get knowledge about what happened to the people, the communities, the families that in some cases had built these libraries through generations. To simplify it, we can say that the Nazis looted 3 kinds of libraries. The first one was libraries on socialist and communist literature. After the invasion of Soviet Union in 1941, the Nazis came upon enormous amount of libraries, archives, especially from the Communist Party. But there were also targets in Western Europe. And one of the most important institutions was an institute in Amsterdam, the Institute of Social History. And this institute had been created in the early 1930s as, you can say, a response to what happened around Europe at that time. This institute's goal was to save an important part of Europe's history, the workers' movements, libraries and archives. And just in a few years, they built a fantastic collections. Because in the 1930s, it wasn't just political refugees. There were libraries and archives on the road that had been smuggled out from Soviet Union, Mussolini's Italy, Franco's Spain, and of course from Hitler, Germany. And one of the most important archives had been smuggled out in the early 1930s from the Nazi Germany. And this small paper here is a part of that, and maybe you can read in the bottom, Karl Marx. This is what you can call the first draft of the Communist Manifesto. They had the Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels archive. And this archive was kind of a holy grail for the Nazis, because the communists, the socialists, the Bolsheviks was one of the Nazis' main enemies. But it wasn't just a political enemy, because there were strong social influences in the Nazi party. Early on, there were parts of the Nazi movement that wanted to nationalize the large companies, for example. You can say that the communists, and especially the Bolsheviks, wasn't so much a political enemy. They were something more. They were part of what you call the Bolshevik communist conspiration. The idea that Jews created the communists, and the Jews ruled actually in Kremlin. And this idea were put ahead, especially from Alfred Rosenberg's point of view. And the Nazis always tried to prove this Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. And one of the most important proofs was, of course, that the communist ideology was founded by a Jew, Karl Marx. Another kind of libraries that were looted were the Freemasons libraries. The Freemasons were one of the first organizations that were attacked in Germany in the 1930s. And why did the Nazis attack the Freemasons? For one instance, they were a secret society, but they were also an international organization. and both didn't work very well in a totalitarian state. But the Nazis also had a special interest for the Freemasons' libraries, and especially the libraries on the occult, libraries on witches, black magic, alchemy. And this interest was especially large in the SS. I will get back to later what they wanted to do with this collection. This is a picture from Clausiana, one of the oldest Freemason libraries in Europe. And this library was looted during the war and has a fantastic collection on literature on alchemy. But of course, the most affected were Jewish libraries. The oldest and most important Jewish libraries in Europe were looted. One of them was in Rome, the library that belonged to the Jewish community in Rome. And this library had a fantastic history because it belonged to a community with a fantastic history. The Jewish community of Rome was one of the oldest Jewish communities in Europe. Some of the first Jews came here as slaves during the Roman age. And this library went down through the ages, and it been saved from the Inquisition in the 15th and 16th century. 1943, this library were put on a German train, and the train headed somewhere into Central Europe, and then it disappeared. This library has never been found. The Italian government had tried to find it for 10 years, but practically failed. And the author Robert Katz had described what this library included. The only copies of books and manuscripts from before Jesus' birth, from the time of the Roman emperors and the early popes. There were engravings from medieval times, books from the first printing presses, and documents that had been passed from hand to hand through history. But the places that you can say that was most affected by the looting was a couple of places in Europe that you can describe as places of Jewish culture and learning. And one of those places was Vilnius. Vilnius was the center, the heart of the Yiddish culture in Eastern Europe. And it was known for its poets, its rabbis, its libraries. And one of the most important institutions here was YIVO, the Yiddish Institute. And as the Institute of Social History, this institute has had a mission to save the Yiddish culture and history. And during a couple of decades, they sent out hundreds of historians, authors, researchers that collected folk tales, songs, ancient manuscripts. This institution, of course, was one of the main targets of the Nazi looters. The problem the Nazis had, especially in Eastern Europe, was that they got more material than they had Nazi researchers that could read Yiddish or Hebrew. So they solved this in a very, you could say, Nazi way. They let the victims do the work. They created slave labor groups of Jewish academics, writers, poets that themselves got to sort through the collections for the Nazis. The sad story is that these places of Jewish culture and learning also was the places that were hardest hit by the Holocaust. And the Nazis, because the Nazis saw these places as dangerous, as places where the Jews could fight back. The other great Jewish center of culture and learning was Thessaloniki. And Thessaloniki, or Salonika, as it was called at the time, isn't as famous today as Vilnius. And it's because its history is almost gone. Here the Nazis succeeded. This was once one of the biggest Jewish cities in Europe, a center for a very special Jewish community, and one of the few European cities when the Jewish population dominated. And this city had been founded by Jews that left Spain in 1492, after the Reconquista, when they were forced to leave Spain. And when they came here from Spain, they brought a unique culture, because these Sephardic Jews had been part of what you call the Arabic translation movement during the Middle Ages. And when a lot of the classics from Greek and Roman literature were saved because they were translated into Arabic. And there were often the Sephardic Jews that did these translations. So when they moved to Thessaloniki, in today's Greece, they took with them their books. And this city, already during the 16th century, became known for its libraries, its culture. When the Nazis came here, almost 400 years later, people still spoke Ladino, the ancient Spanish Jewish language. This was a society, a culture, a whole civilization that perished during the Holocaust. Not only the people disappeared, but also their history and their culture. The libraries and archives of this culture were looted and scattered. Today, when you walk around in Thessaloniki, you see few traces from this civilization that existed here for less than 100 years. But there are some traces. Outside the city wall, where there today is the Aristoteles University, was once one of Europe's largest Jewish cemeteries, 500,000 graves. During the war, this cemetery was blown up, destroyed, and then they used the stones as building material. The SS used it to build a swimming pool at the SS Villa, but also ordinary Greeks used it. So today, when you know where to look, you can find pieces of this history. I found it at the small wall in the center that smelled of urine, in a wall built in the 60s. And here I found part of a Jewish gravestone. And you can say that these words on this stone are some of the few words that still exist from this lost civilization. Who were the men who were responsible for this? Of course, one of them was Heinrich Himmler. SS was one of the big looters of books. And during the war, they started to build a big collection in Berlin, a big library that they called the Library of the Enemies of the Reich. And it was a library with different departments for Jews, communists, Freemasons, Catholics, everyone that they perceived as an enemy. And at this library, they planned to study their enemy, but not only to destroy them in a physical sense, but also to fight their ideas, their thoughts. Here they're going to fight the idea, the intellectual war. But the SS also did other kind of research, and especially research on the occult. There are often some popular descriptions of the Nazi interest in the occult. It wasn't the interest that went through the whole Nazi movement, but it was strong, especially in SS. And maybe the strangest research that I did was the the Witch Project. It went on for almost 10 years. And in this project, they collected material on thousands of witches that had been burned from the Middle Ages and forward. And they collected this to an archive that was called Himmlers Häxkartotek. Why did they do this? You can say that Nazi Germany was probably the only regime in history that was positive to witches. They loved witches. And they often described them like Nordic Amazons. The Nazi interest in witches is that, especially in SS, they saw the witch hunts and the burnings of witches as part of a larger war between civilizations. The witches were victims in a war between the Catholic Semitic Church and the true Nordic faiths and myths. It was a way for the Catholic Church to destroy the true Nordic religions and ideas in SS perspective. The other person that was responsible for the looting and maybe the most serious collector is the man in the hat here, Alfred Rosenberg. He's one of the lesser known persons in the Nazi elite, but I think some of the most important. In the early 1930s, Hitler appointed him the role of the parties as the party's spiritual leader, the chief ideologist. And Rosenberg's mission was to purify, develop, and protect the Nazi ideology. And Rosenberg realized one thing, that the Nazi movement wasn't held together by its ideology, but by something else. It was held together by the cult surrounding the man in the middle. The cult, the Hitler cult, and the Führer cult. Rosenberg believed that if the man in the center disappeared, everything would come crashing down. But how would you build an empire that would last in 1,000 years if it all depends on just one man? Rosenberg meant that they needed something else. Of course, they needed an idea, but an idea can't exist without institutions. And he especially looked at the Catholic Church. He meant that what would Christianity be without the Catholic Church? The power of this institution. Would the Christian faith even exist today without this institution? Rosenberg meant to create such new Nazi institutions. And he believed the two most important areas was education and science. Already during the 1930s, the Nazis started to experiment on special elite schools. They created the Adolf Hitler schools for young gifted boys. Then they went to the Ordensburg schools. It was like a military academy where you both should read Goethe and shoot a machine gun. You should be what the Nazis described as poetic warriors. And they would finish their education at Rosenberg's crown jewel, the University of the Nazi Party. This was a school that was planned to be built in the south of Germany after the war. And here the Nazi would create the future leadership of Nazi Germany and secure the future. But this institution would also be the head of another pillar, research and science. Connected to this university, Alfred Rosenberg planned several institutions spread out over Germany that would study some of the Nazis' favorite questions. Indo-German, German history, folk history, Celts, Eastern research, for example. And it was mainly for these institutions and institutes that the Rosenberg organization looted. But there were only one of these that were officially open during the war, the last one, the Institute of the Jewish Question. And this was an institute and a question that Rosenberg meant had to be dealt right now. And it was actually opened in 1941 when the Holocaust started. And its project and its operation was connected to the Holocaust. At this institute, Nazi researchers studied Jewish history, language, culture. And to this institute, some of the most important Jewish collections were sent. Why was it so important to study Jewish history and culture? When Alfred Rosenberg inaugurated the institute, he said that it may come a day when our grandchildren grow up in a world freed from Jews, where maybe they can't really understand the threat the Jews proposed for our time. Therefore, the goal of this institute is to remind them. And he said the human memory is very short. What Alfred Rosenberg was afraid of was, of course, that future generations in the world without Jews would judge them for their actions, and that they wouldn't understand why they had to do this horrible thing. I think one of the most important lessons about the looting is that it wasn't done to eradicate the history or culture of their enemies, but to take control over it. Because if you own your enemies' libraries, if you own their books, their archives, you also have the power to write their history. And that was the main goal with the looting. As Alan Coffini puts it in his book, A World Without Jews, remembering the Jews after the victorious war would have been important precisely because total liquidation of the Jews could not have been achieved by physical annihilation alone. It required as well the overcoming of Jewish history, memory and history. The Nazi struggle against the Jews was never principally about the political and economical influence. It was about the identity waged by the means of Nazi appropriation of Jewish history, memory and books. The Nazis wanted future generations to remember what happened, but only by taking control over Jewish history and culture could the Nazis also take control over the memory of the Jews in a world where they didn't exist anymore. In the Nazi worldview, the Jew would become the devil, an incarnation of evil that would scare the children long after they were dead. After the war, these books, libraries, and archives were found all over Europe. And their fate was very different depending on who found them and where they were found. Early in 1945, Stalin, in a secret operation, created the so-called Soviet trophy brigades. And the goal of these brigades was to take as much as they could from Germany, but also from Central Europe. And the Soviet trophy brigades took over 11 million books to the Soviet Union that were looted, and many, many more from German libraries and universities. Many of these collections were scattered, separated, and most of these books have never been returned. It was a different procedure in the West, where the monuments men sorted and succeeded in returning millions of books at the Offenbach Depot, a sorting center outside Frankfurt. Among them, many of the books that had been found at the Frankfurt Institute. But there was still a problem. Even if you could find out who owned the book, it was far from certain that there was still someone to return the book to. As one of the monuments men later wrote, "In the sorting room, I would come upon a box of books which the sorters had brought together, like scattered sheep into one fold, books from a library which once had been in some distant town in Poland or an extinct yeshiva. There was something sad and mournful about these volumes, as they were whispering a tale of yearning and hope, since obliterated. I would find myself straightening out these books and arranging them in the boxes with a personal sense of tenderness, as if they had belonged to someone dear to me, someone recently deceased." Many of these books were later sent out to Jewish communities, to institutions around the world. But still, despite both the efforts to loot books after the war and return them, there were millions and millions of books left in German libraries and in other European libraries. And when I traveled around Europe, I found them everywhere. In my book, I especially focused on a library in Berlin, the Zentral- und Landesbibliothek. Today there are estimates that it could be around 250,000 looted books just in this library. And most of the looted books at this library aren't valuable books, aren't important books. It's just books that belonged to ordinary people. Because the Nazis didn't just loot books from important libraries and archives, they looted from everyone. In 1942, Alfred Rosenberg initiated the so-called M-Aktion, Möbelaktion. It was an operation where 70,000 homes in France, the Netherlands, and Belgium were emptied of everything: furniture, toys, linen, and of course books. And hundreds of thousands of these books were brought to Germany and often sold to German libraries. And the library in Berlin, they don't have big collections either. They have one or a few books from thousands and thousands of small libraries. And today, a small team of librarians sort through a collection of 7 million books by hand. And they have worked for almost a decade, and they had returned 600 books. So you understand that this is something that's going to go on for decades or maybe for generations. One question I asked when I came to this library was, why hasn't this been brought up earlier? The library started to do this research 10 years ago. And one important reason was that it wasn't librarians that were held responsible for the crimes after the war. The same librarians, archivists that had taken part of the looting held their positions after the war and often tried to hide this history. They hid the traces, and today you can find a lot of books that look like this, when you have tried to destroy Jewish book plates. In other cases, they have tried to falsify catalogs. During the war, there wasn't a problem to put a J in the books for Jewish books. It didn't look as good after the war. So they tried to make it a donation from someone with J, Jacob or something. And you can also ask, why is it important to return these books? They aren't valuable. And 10 years of work for 600 books. And it's 600 books to around a little more than 100 people. And in my book, I wanted to follow one of these single books because I understood that every one of these books also carried a history. And as one of the librarians here said, it's often a history that ends in Auschwitz. And I came in contact with this book. And this book was a book that belonged to just an ordinary German Jewish man that was called Richard Kubrick. And he was a lawyer in Berlin and lived there with his wife and 3 children. And he didn't really have a Jewish identity. The family was Christian, and he had been awarded an Iron Cross after his service in the First World War. So when Hitler came to power, he refused to leave Germany. He meant that he was more German than that Austrian Hitler. And that was a mistake, of course. After the Kristallnacht, they understood that they'd done a big mistake. And they tried to get out, and they succeeded sending out the 3 children. But Richard Kubrick and his wife died in Auschwitz. I took this book and followed it to Richard Kubrick's son, Helmut Kubrick. Helmut Kubrick was 15 years old when he came to Great Britain in 1939. The problem was that the British didn't see him as a Jewish refugee. So they arrested him and deported him on a ship with prisoners to Australia. It took almost 10 years for him to get back to his sisters in England. I took this book and returned it to Helmut's daughter, a woman living in a small village outside Birmingham. And this book was the first thing the family ever got back from Richard Kubrick. This was a man that had left almost nothing. They didn't have any photographs, they didn't have a grave, of course. And in some ways, this book was the only proof that he ever existed. I think this tells something important about restitution, because with the focus on art, restitution has been a lot about the value of artworks and money. But I mean, the moral center, the moral quest of the restitution isn't economical compensation. That's important, but it's not the moral center. It's to give back something of the lives and worlds that was destroyed. To return a book to Thessaloniki is a way to return a small part of a history that isn't here anymore. And this book here, it's practically worthless. You can buy it for $1 at the bookseller. But for this family, it's the most important book in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders, for this very interesting and moving presentation. And Before we go to questions and answers, a word from our sponsor. I'm Taru Spiegel. I work in the European Division, and I have many wonderful colleagues here, and also from Africa, Middle East, and elsewhere in the library. We're here to answer your questions. You can reach us by coming here, by emailing us, by going to Ask a Librarian. You just Google Ask a Librarian, and there you are. And your question will be routed to the appropriate people. So thank you. Helena.
We have a little time for questions. Who would like to begin? Yes.
Should I stand or should I?
Standing's great. Or if you want to come and ask at the microphone, that's fine.
I think if it's all right, this is okay. First of all, thank you very much for your words today. In your book, I'm reading with great interest. In your book, I began reading the chapter about Vilnius, and one thing that I was wondering is, throughout your research, were you able to learn of or locate any books that belong to the Vilna Gaon?
And we'll just briefly repeat. So for those who are watching the webcast later, this is an appreciation for the talk, and then a question: has Anders seen any of the books that were at Vilnius?
No, I'm sorry, I haven't, actually, because they aren't there anymore. And as I think some people here know, a lot of the book from Vilnius, especially the books that were found at the Frankfurt Institute, were actually sent to New York. Yeah, to the YIVO Institute in New York, because YIVO had already at that time a department in New York. It was like a side department, but it became the main YIVO because the other YIVOs were destroyed. But it was a question at that time that they wanted to send the books back to the Lithuania. But of course, at that time, it wasn't possible for YIVO to exist there because, as you know, in the Soviet Union, it wasn't allowed to have alternative identities, not officially.
So it sounds like head to New York City. Other questions?
I just didn't remember, which was the one that was never found again?
It was the library of the Jewish community in Rome.
In Rome?
Yeah. They had two libraries, and I showed a picture from the second one.
Yeah.
And it was the lesser important library. But the community's library is lost. And some believe it's in Russia, but no one really knows. Some believe it's had been destroyed. And it's really sad because it's such a fantastic library. And the library was actually not that old. It was brought together when they took down the Jewish ghetto in Rome. And as you maybe know, the Jewish ghetto in Rome was the last ghetto in Europe before the Nazi created them again in the end of the 19th century. And these books were brought together because they had been hidden, because the Inquisition had went into the Jewish ghetto in Rome several times, collected Jewish books and burned them. So these books had been hidden away from the Catholic Church for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then the Nazis destroyed them.
There was another question on this side of the room, please.
Have any families made claims for their libraries if they're aware that these collections are out there?
So the question is, have any families made claims for their libraries as they become more aware that the books still exist? Some of the books exist.
Yes, and especially at this library that I told you about, the Central and Landesbibliothek in Berlin, they actively search for people, but it's a very time-consuming work. So what they're doing right now is putting up all information they can get from a book, bookplates, names and everything on the internet. So a lot of people actually find them when they're doing research on their family, on their history. But the problem is, of course, that a lot of the survivors, were scattered all over the world. changed name, changed identity, and everything. So it's also difficult sometimes to know who would we return it to. It was one of the siblings went to Australia, one to Argentina, one to the United States, for example. So it's a very difficult question.
Anyone else? All right. Oh,
Were German scholars assigned to revise or otherwise more accurately distort Jewish history? And if so, did English Jewish scholars challenge this assignment?
During which time?
During the Nazi era.
okay. So I believe the question is, during the Nazi era, were any of the people assigned to change history? How has that come into the literature?
Well, did any of them, did that happen? And did any of those challenge that?
And how was this rewriting of history challenged?
Yeah. Could I borrow your book? I mean, the Nazis, I mean, they wanted to own Jewish memory and history. And some of the Jewish writers, scholars, understood this, especially in Vilnius. And especially one of the librarians, the librarian of the Ghetto of Vilnius, Herman Kruk. And I'll just find the section here. Oh, that's the next one. Yeah, during all the time the ghetto existed, he put down a diary. He wrote everything down. What kind of books people borrowed, what happened, and they also created at the library a secret organization. They collected all the German orders and material from the Germans because they understood if the Germans want to control our memory, we must protect our history and get it out somewhere, somehow. Yeah, and after the ghetto in Vilnius was destroyed, Herman Kruk was sent to a labor camp in Estonia. Herman Kruk was deported to a forced labor camp in Lagedi, Estonia. He would continue to keep a journal to the very end. On September 17th, 1944, he wrote his final note. I'm burying the manuscripts in Lagedi, in Herr Schulman's barrack, opposite the guardhouse. 6 people are present for the funeral. He buried all his diaries to save them because he sensed that something was wrong. Kruk had a sense of what awaited him. The next day, he and 2,000 other prisoners were forced to carry wooden lodges to a forest outside the camp. The logs were put down in long rows, whereupon the prisoners were forced to lie down on top of them. They had built their own funeral pyres. After the Nazi guards had shot the prisoners in the head, another layer of logs and prisoners were added on top, and thereafter another and another. When the Red Army reached the scene a few days later, unburned bodies still lay in the piles. But one of the witnesses of Herman Kruk's funeral managed to flee and went back to dig up his diaries.
I think that brings us to a good ending. I invite you again to view some of the books from the Jewish Cultural Restoration Commission that are here at the Library of Congress, as well as the bookplate tools that help match former owners right at the end of World War II. But there are also copies of the book for sale in the next room, and Anders will be ready to sign. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.